Harry, you're very welcome to another episode of Kickoff Sessions. Before we started recording, I said I was very interested in your company, all around podcast agencies. I think it's a very narrow niche. I think it's very original. I think I don't see many people doing it, and I see people that do try it are not up to the standard that you've been at because it's very much very specialized and pretty much like an early mover on this kind of scene. So I was very impressed from the outset.
Oh, thanks very much. Pleasure to be here. I don't know that. I wish I could say that was true, but I definitely feel like we were even a couple of years behind some even smarter people than me. Even smarter, much smarter people than me. But yeah, we're lucky that we've been around for kind of 5 years or so now, and doing this exclusively. Podcast production is all we do, and it's we seem to have positioned ourselves in the right spot for that kind of explosive year we saw through 2020. It's been a really interesting time.
Caught it at the right time, just caught that essentially just hype and trend at the right time. But it's
That's
interesting
it.
you say that, like, oh, you were late to the party, because we all think that we're like late to starting things, but in matter of fact, we're kind of not. When I started a podcast,
Mhm.
people were saying that, oh, everyone has a podcast in the world, but how much people have got to 10 episodes, how much people have got to 20 episodes, 50, and so
Absolutely.
on. Like it begins to diminish from there. But bit of a background, like, what is a podcast agency for people? Why did you start doing it, and what was your beginning in podcasting? Because even looking at your setup here, super professional, and what didn't happen overnight, I presume.
No, absolutely. No, well, thank you. I like to try and it's all part of my smoke and mirrors to make it look as if I know what I'm doing is to have the fancy gear. But yeah, so I've been doing this for or running Lower Street has been around for 5 years. My background was in audio post production, so I came out of university doing a degree in audio, and then I worked in some studios in London, working with sort of big brand agencies back then in Soho, and that was great, a real education. Um, but incredibly stressful. So a real education of what I didn't want to do in my career as well. So I did that. And then after that, I actually ended up, the reason I stopped it was I got fired because I lost the voice recordings of a Domestos advert back in the day. So I don't know if you remember the adverts where they had those little tiny bacteria characters. One of the things they would record in the studio was all the voiceover for that stuff. And I screwed up on the on my part of the job, and some audio files were lost, which cost the company a couple of grand. And so they were very, very displeased with that, and got rid of me. And to be honest, I'm grateful that they did, because it was painful at the time, but that experience working there was extremely stressful. So I left that, and then ended up working in various sales and marketing roles. And until about sort of 5-6 years ago, I realized I was spending a lot of time listening to podcasts. I knew I wanted to start my own business, but I wasn't sure what area it should be in. And similar to you, I imagine I spent a lot of time listening to podcasts to educate myself on what I should be doing. And it was sort of through that process that it kind of dawned on me, well, hey, look, I've got the audio background. This is my sort of unfair advantage in this space. Clearly there's kind of a growing demand in kind of podcasting generally, but then also I kind of, in my sales and marketing roles, they've been in this sort of corporate space. So I kind of spoke the language of the bigger brands, and sort of understood the things that they cared about and the way that they communicated and all that kind of stuff. So it sort of made sense to position myself as that. And so that's what we've done. Slowly over the last 5 years, it's just kind of build on that from just being me, trying to make myself to be this big company, but really it's just me in my bedroom, up to the point now that we are 5 years later with the team of coming on 15 people, and working with some really kind of big brands, making shows that we're really proud of. So it's been a bit of a journey, and I think that 2020 was just a big kind of turning point for the industry at large. I think COVID really forced a lot of people to think about everything to do with remote working, and remote communication. And podcasting is obviously one of the kind of chief platforms there to sort of communicate with not only your team, but the sort of wider world. And so it was a huge sort of uplift in the amount of people thinking about podcasts, both personally and professionally. And so, the rising tide lifts all boats, and certainly the branded side, I think a lot of people have seen it. And then what happens is people see their competitors doing it, and then they want to do it as well. So we've really kind of been in this position that that's been incredibly fortunate over the last kind of 18 months or so. So yeah, it's an interesting, exciting space. And I think as things mature, brands and podcasters, creators, whether that's brands that like we work with, or individuals like yourself, I think are getting more and more bold and kind of confident to invest in the medium and bold in the sort of ways that they approach it and think about it. Because I think there's a lot in podcasting that hasn't been explored yet.
Exactly.
I think there's a lot of kind of, there's the sort of classic business podcast has been around for a long time, two people talking, and that's great. And we're doing it here and it's a wonderful, valuable thing. But I think there's just so many more kind of things that are out there and people are starting to experiment with, like you said, just before we jumped on the call, the way that you're using video and kind of integrating your social media community as part of the podcast and making that really kind of one kind of cohesive thing. It's not just the audio, it's the audio plus the video plus your social. I think all this kind of stuff is super interesting at the moment. So it's an exciting space.
It's awesome. It's so sick that you've taken it from your original interest. Like same with me, all started off with Tim Ferriss or, a bit of Joe Rogan and whatnot. And then you're like, okay, maybe I could do this. Maybe I could do it on my own kind of level, but it's awesome. You've had that background experience. But one of my original podcasts was with a guy from a company called WorkVivo, a really cool employee engagement platform, which actually works a lot with a lot of podcasts. But he said something that was really interesting was about you could be a good entrepreneur with a bad idea and nothing can work out, or you could be a bad entrepreneur with a good idea in the right time at the right place, and you just get carried with the wave. And not to say that you're a bad entrepreneur.
I was going to say that sounds like you just described me. That's exactly who I am.
But I'm saying
it's
just been that period.
That happened to be the right place at the right time.
But it's that period. It's a period that it's been that explosive growth, and you've done your dues, you've done your hard work, and it's paid dividends to you. But it's a fantastic time for people to get going. And I think what's happening now is that we have this new form of audio, whether it's the original, like this is the OG where it's just me and you chatting, and then as I was saying to you earlier about how I moved more into Instagram podcasting, which is just so abstract and so like unoriginal that you wouldn't think of at first, so even for an agency like yourself or people that are offering consulting advice, like these are the new forms of media. And I've seen it with my own company. I've seen it with other companies that they're like, okay, well, if this company X is doing something, then company Y is doing something. So that's from the business side of it, but then from the actual the value of delivering a message, from actually going deeper on topics, this is where podcasting is excellent. Because what I often find, what I think is really really important is that, so I'm doing a lot of work on LinkedIn, I'm doing a lot of long form written content, but even at that, the post stops when you stop. Whereas when you get to audio, you can just expand on things a lot more detail. A founder or an entrepreneur or, a business leader can go into more detail and provide a bit more color, because like often it's very hard to express your full, emotion as well as actual ideas through just posts and media, and we're very restricted as it is, being able to what we can post online, what we can't post online. So when you get to a podcast, it can be much more fleshed out,
That's it. I completely agree. There's a lot of space to kind of add a lot of your own personality, your own opinion, your own kind of take on things. But also I think there's also just the other element of the fact that you're able to build relationships in a way that's much deeper than it would be just on a LinkedIn post. Like it's great to kind of tag someone on a post or write about someone's company or whatever. You can kind of connect with them on that basis, but actually spending 45 minutes on a interview here on Zoom is a level of connection that you just can't get through a LinkedIn post. So I think there's loads of benefits to being a podcaster, despite, outside of just like building an audience of listeners. Actually, I think, quite often the interviews themselves are potentially even more valuable than the audience. So yeah, I think it's fantastic.
And what's like class about those conversations is you get to such a low level of detail that I often leave absolutely fried from the experience. Take out my earphones, I'm just exhausted from it, but as you said, you're developing those relationships, you're developing those connections, and you don't know when they can come back to pay dividends. So even for myself, it is a business podcast. Like, we're doing career stuff, we'll be doing some fintech stuff, we're doing loads of kind of random things at times. But then often, like, I'd be able to lean in and then, be like, oh, hey, I'm looking for support here or whatnot, or I'm trying to launch a company or whatever. I see that reward coming back. So I think people might get discouraged at first, saying that, your episodes are going to be shit or you're not going to get that engagement. But looking at podcast engagement figures, like, can ruin your mind, because like I always compare it to like Instagram. Like Instagram, I like to call it as ass and abs. Like, you just get, like, people just get likes for just bullshit, But when you get to podcasting, like, you fight for those downloads, man. like I've been in those trenches, man. I've been fighting for those downloads, and
Absolutely.
they're hard come by, they're hard like done by, and
Yeah,
also to
but also
improve
they
that
mean
retention.
something, and they stick around. I
Yeah,
think if you find a listener that really resonates with your style, with your kind of personality, but also the topics that you specifically are interested in and focus on, like you mentioned, you talk about fintech, you talk about career stuff, like whatever those things are that are interesting to you.
mm-hmm.
If you find the right listener that really latches onto that and yeah, kind of identifies with your point of view, that's a much more powerful kind of relationship, and one that will last much longer than a quick like on your ass and your abs. Like and not only that, not only the sort of the longevity of the relationship over time, but also the amount of time you're spending with them on a weekly basis. Like, so this show is weekly. Each episode is, I don't know, 45 minutes, let's say. So that's 45 minutes of someone's time you're getting on a weekly basis. So even if you've got 50 of those people, like if I was to say to you, great, if you hold an event in Dublin next week and you're going to get a couple of speakers and try to get some people down, you'd probably be pretty pumped to get 50, 100 people in the room. And sure, you wouldn't have had, it would have taken you a while to break through that barrier in podcasting, but I think I don't know what your numbers are, but you'll, I'm sure, have a number of people listening to this show. And those numbers will be, actually really impressive when you compare it to like real in-person events. But the level of engagement that you're getting with those however many listeners is just as high.
And if you think about as well how long they stay like connected with your work. So like an average episode, I think like if I had an hour episode, you're looking at usually, well, the average time might be 30 minutes people would stay engaged for, which is so high. I was looking at a recent episodes about 35 minutes, and if you compare that to YouTube, I think the average time is like 3 minutes or like 6 minutes. So
exactly right. Yeah,
it's pretty crazy.
Forget it with like kind of social video. We're lucky we see like 5-8% completion rates on videos on Facebook or whatever, which is just like, so podcasting is a massive win there. It's definitely a lot more effort too, right? Like this is more work than putting out a quick Twitter post or an Instagram story or whatever, but I think the benefits are there.
Exactly. You said something really interesting there about like fans and like getting like 50 people or whatever. So you're obviously probably aware of him, Pat Flynn from Smart Passive Income, like one of like the OGs of the game. Like he has a book called I think it's called Superfans. I'm not too sure that the actual name. I think it's called Superfans. But basically the whole idea is that his concept is like you can have, if you build 1,000 superfans in total, if you have 1,000 at a time, you can pretty much live the rest of your life, because within that 1,000, some will leave, some will come in, but that 1,000 you can build an audience, you can sell products, you can provide services, you can have monthly income, you can have reoccurring services, but you have a core competency of 1,000. It's not 1 million. You look at an Instagram page, or I don't know, even someone on Twitter, they have like hundreds of thousands of followers, and it's a big discouragement, because I'm like, I'm not getting into that, because I'm like, I'm not going through that process of trying to get this crazy numbers. But if you see how much level of input how much level of like engagement you really need to be able to grow, that's where it becomes very valuable.
No, absolutely. Yeah. So I think there's an essay that was written by a guy called Kevin Kelly called 1,000 True Fans. That might have been what Pat Flynn was sort of referencing, and maybe he's kind of expanded on it, because I know he's a smart dude himself. But yeah, Kevin Kelly had this sort of theory of 1,000 true fans, and basically, I think he was a musician or is a musician, and his idea was, if you had 1,000 true fans, they would come to every gig, they would buy every album, they would buy a t-shirt when it comes out, they would come to that event you're playing at 3 cities over to make sure that they get the chance to have you sign their record or whatever it was. And that's the same thing here. And I think you're really hard pressed to find a true fan on social. You might be able to engage with those true fans on social and like maintain that relationship actively and every day and give them all those regular touch points. But I think it's much harder, and I'm sure there's some Instagram kind of influencers that can tell me I'm full of it. But I think it's much harder to build that really deep relationship in an Instagram or a TikTok or whatever. Whereas in podcasting, you do have that opportunity, I think, to really get people, because it's very personal. Like people that have been listening to 50 episodes of you will know who you are very deeply. They'll have a relationship with Darren, even if you've never met them. They'll have a sense of who you are and your personality and all that kind of stuff. And that really lends itself to people actually caring about you and being invested in you as a person that they like, know, and trust for an extended period of time. So yeah, I think it's good.
That's the way forward. That's exactly it. You don't need everybody. You don't need to reach for hundreds of thousands of people. It's just be a core number. So this kind of touch on why we should do it, like why we should start podcasting, why brands should do it. Next question is like, how should we do it? So, I have my kind of approach, probably wasn't the best. The guy over there has another approach, but from your own perspective, like how should people kind of really launch at the start and start with the right tendencies? We don't need to go into grave detail, but like for people that I want to, start in the right pillars. And I know for myself, a lot of the mistakes I made at first, looking back at it, I wish I could have went to video first. Maybe I wish I showed up on more social platforms. I didn't have the time, but I wish I showed up on more platforms a bit more. And I think I should have been a bit more maybe personal at first. But that's they were things I learned from very, very early on.
Yeah. Well, so the buzzwords, if we're playing sort of podcast bingo, the buzzwords that come up all the time is authenticity, intimacy, words like that. That's what podcasting is really good at. So I think absolutely just embrace yourself, basically, like what you're into, the things that excite you. Just like focus on your personality. Don't feel like you have to be the podcast host and sort of be formal or whatever. Like if your style is to be super relaxed and chatty, just lean into that and share some of your own opinion on things. Don't just kind of ask questions and let the guest kind of just bounce back with their canned answer. Like actually have some thoughts and opinions. I think really just embracing yourself, your personality is a really kind of important thing with podcasting. And to be fair, it's something that can only come with practice and comfort. You just get comfortable with yourself and being on the mic and being on the camera. So that's a general thing. I think the most important things to keep in mind when you're launching a podcast is to be really, really clear up front of what are you trying to achieve and who are you trying to reach. If you know what your goals are, then you can determine what kind of guests you want to speak to, what success looks like to you. Is it about kind of extending your personal network? Is it about building an audience? Is it about monetization? Is it something else? Whatever that looks like, I think being really, really clear on that upfront is super important, because that's going to shape the style of show that you make and the way that you're kind of measuring it and refining it over time. The two things to get clear on are what are the goals for you and who is your ideal listener or your target listener. So yeah, knowing what you want to do up front, whether it's monetization, whether it's growing your personal network, whether it is building an audience and a brand for yourself. Knowing that upfront is really important so that you can kind of adapt the style of show, and the way that you're measuring it and refining it over time is going to be kind of informed by that. The second thing to understand really clearly is who your ideal listener is, who you're trying to reach. I think a lot of people, one of the biggest mistakes I see is that people just launch a show. I've got a great idea for a show. I'm going to interview X, Y, and Z people about this topic because that's what I want to see in the world. That sounds great. Let's go and do it. And then what they have to do is they have to work backwards to try and figure out how they can find listeners for that thing that they've created. What I think is much more productive and much more likely to succeed is if you say, okay, these are the people that I want to reach. Let me really understand who they are and what they're about. What are the podcasts they're already listening to? What problems they're facing? The things that they want to try and improve, and go and make the show that they need. So that's because that way, that you have an audience that's sitting there waiting, saying, hey, look, I need someone to make this content for me. And then you can be the person to go and make that and put it in front of them. So I think that's absolutely the most productive place to start. Being really, really clear on those, because that decision of who you're trying to reach is going to impact, cool, what other podcasts am I competing with? How do I brand this thing so it really stands apart? How can I kind of differentiate the people that I'm speaking to, or the way that the show is formatted, or the style, or whatever of the podcast can be informed by that kind of fact. What I would say, by the way, as a sort of side note, if you've already started a show, it's really important that you survey your audience, try and understand who they are and what they're about and why they're engaged with you, because you want to understand, like we talked about the 1,000 true fans before, right? Like you want to understand, maybe right now I've only got 25 true fans, but that's awesome. Like, let's go find them, really kind of get to know what it is, why are they fans? What is it that keeps them coming back? And make sure that you kind of give more of that and less of the stuff that they're not interested in. So really being really heavily kind of listener focused, I think is super important. So yeah, that's always what I recommend is think about your goals up front and your listener are the two kind of core things.
if you think about that as well, like you're really working from like customer focus backwards. So instead of seeing like
Exactly.
what you want, because like, we kind of all here when it comes to like a product, we need to be thinking about that. Like obviously think with the customer in
Hmm.
mind, but podcasting is the exact same unless you want to talk to nobody. If you want to have these conversations with just me and you, that's perfectly fine,
Exactly.
but then it shouldn't be a
Yeah.
podcast, it should be a regular call. So I think,
Exactly. Although that being said, I think that's one of the other things that I was going to say is that actually that version of things can work really well. So if your goal
Mhm,
from starting a podcast is to increase your personal network, to sort of create connections in a space. So when I started my company in podcasting, I knew nobody. I had no connections. I had no network of any sort. I just
mhm,
worked in jobs before. I had no sort of network that I could draw on to help me kind of launch that podcast, this podcasting company. And so if I was to start again, it would definitely be about building that network first, and then having kind of people to talk to when I had this thing ready to go to. So that's a really valid reason to start a podcast, because a podcast is a great way to sort of build that first network, as I'm sure you've learned through doing this.
mhm,
And I think in that case, if that's your goal, well, then actually, like we actually have clients that use it in this way. So they're agencies, and they use the podcast to have conversations with prospects for their business that they're not yet working with. It's so much better to go to a prospect and say, hey, would you like to be a guest on my podcast, than it is to say, hey, do you want my stuff? Like, do you want this thing
yeah,
that I'm trying to sell you? So it's a really
100%.
wonderful way to kind of build that relationship. So that works whether you're an individual trying to grow a personal network, or a business trying to kind of grow your business network.
Mhm,
If that's the case, you don't care about how many people are listening, because the value is not in the listeners. The value is in those conversations, and the podcast is just an excuse to have those things. And so, yeah, you sort of mentioned, yeah, well, no one's going to be listening, but actually 99% of guests won't really care how many listeners. Like, I didn't ask you how many listeners you had before coming on this podcast. I just thought, well, Darren seems like a cool guy. He's doing good stuff. Let's have a conversation. It's an hour of my time, and I think there'll be some value in it. So let's just do that. And I think most people feel that way. And actually, again, it depends what space you're in, but 99% of people haven't been invited onto a podcast before. So actually we see really strong response rates, right? So you say, do you want to be on my podcast? And you're a graduate that's starting out in their career, and like, how do I get into this industry that I'm trying to get into? Well, then why not just interview the top 50 people in your industry on a
100%.
podcast? It's just a really fantastic way to start a career. So there are loads of different ways to think about podcasting and how to see success, but that is where you need to start. Is like, why am I doing this in the first place? Like, is
Yeah,
it just a vanity? Like, be really honest with yourself. Is it a vanity project? Because if it is, great, that's
yeah.
awesome. Let's prioritize vanity, and just like make sure that you can get cool guests on and talk about it on social and make it look
Mhm.
nice and sound good and look professional and have a fancy microphone so you can tell your friends. That's awesome. Like, if that's your reason for doing it, I think it's just being clear about that and optimizing for it in the outset.
Couldn't agree more with that, man. Especially because like even my own reason, as in like, started off because I was in my own career and I was like, why are you doing a careers podcast? Because I was unhappy with my career. I didn't like where I was
Mm-hmm.
going. Did a lot of work. Was doing a lot of work on what I was doing. Didn't like it. Didn't like the result. And then I wanted to open up these new like network connections, meet new people, and essentially just like talk through like problems. And then I kind of felt like myself. I was like, well,
Right.
I have these problems. They're all bundled up in my head. They're all career issues that I have for young professionals. Maybe other people
Mm-hmm.
do. Turned out my
Right.
roommates were the same. They all fucking hated their jobs too. And now the feedback I get from people is like, oh yeah, like, it's not like I'm changing my life, but it's like, yeah, I'm doing this stuff too. A lot of it is kind of shit at times and stuff, and I'm trying to improve it. So there was
Mm-hmm.
that kind of aspect of it. And then there was, of course, like the complete network side of it. I was like, I haven't spoke to anyone because of COVID in Jesus, six months at that stage. So the idea
Yeah.
was I wanted to record like deep conversations with people that I actually like respected and whatnot. So I started off with
Mm-hmm.
five names on a spreadsheet. If I could get five people on a spreadsheet that I could record with, I knew I could keep this up because 5 weeks was
Yep.
over a month's content essentially. So it started out with something like that. And then I was kind of figuring things out and seeing that kind of slow growth. But it was like, all right, listeners at the beginning were, absolutely fucking appalling. Well, it started off good and then it kind of like dipped in the ebb and flow of life. But it was kind of like,
Sure.
what's the core reason for this? And just like you said about prospecting clients as a business, for me and for individuals, my idea was it was my CV. So that's what I was
Yep.
thinking next. And I was like, okay, young dude interested in like fintech, finance, business, entrepreneurship, startups. If I have a podcast like this, I can just lean that towards it. And then someone says, oh, like, what do you do in your spare time? Well, it's like, I'm interested in fintech. Here is my podcast that expresses this at length, you know? So there was
Yep.
always that kind of like, well, it's not a really hidden agenda, but it's like a second why, you know? So that's it from a
Absolutely.
individual perspective. And if you think of it from a company perspective, then it's like, you know, here's our team, here's what we do, here's the way we build, and you get a bit more familiar with it, because I think people smell bullshit really quickly, especially now. You know, like I had a podcast with a guy recently, and we are talking about like Love Island. Okay, so
Okay.
interesting. He was like, these guys have like millions of followers after Love Island, right? And he was like,
Right.
what sort of like delusional person actually goes to buy these products? Like, why would you go buy like fake tan, or this get fucking fit quick scheme? Like, you know, it's only like you don't actually have like actual trust with those people, you know, so it doesn't really work
Sure.
like that, you know. So he was kind of saying like the concept of going into real detail and giving your audience much more of a background to why you're doing things, getting into the detail, and that's when you see actual results from a client perspective or network perspective.
Absolutely. That's what podcasting is. It's narrow and it's deep. You're gonna catch a smaller audience, but you're gonna go really deep with that audience versus, you know, an Instagram or whatever, TikTok, whatever it is. You're gonna
Yeah.
have a really wide spread, but probably a
Mhm.
really tiny sliver of those really care about what it is that you do, or have enough of a kind of trust or liking of you, like you mentioned, to actually take action on anything it is that you have to offer.
Mhm. So people are probably like kind of wondering from here as well, like if I launch a podcast and I want to grow it and I want to try to monetize it, like how do I do that? You know,
Mm-hmm.
so for me, like what I've heard is like, well, not what I've heard, like the original kind of podcasting monetization would be ads that you see. So you see Tim Ferriss,
Mm-hmm.
you see Joe Rogan plugging ads, which is good.
Yep.
You need a lot of downloads to make a lot of money off ads. And then there's also affiliate programs. So you can sign up to, I don't know, it could be like Coinbase and make money through Coinbase, like essentially like that, you know, affiliate
Yep.
programs. Um, but for the ordinary person that's trying to grow a small brand, how would you advise that? Because I've heard a lot about getting, you know, building up a relationship with an existing brand and getting them in on kind of like a different kind of contract to try to get yourself some revenue in return with a high engaged audience.
Yeah. So I guess my first advice would be, don't go into podcasting with a view to monetize unless you're really all in, heavily in on podcasting. Like it's a very, very hard leap to make. As you mentioned, the kind of predominant way to monetize podcasts is through sponsorships, and sponsorships are typically, or historically have been, based on a CPM, so a cost per thousand downloads. And typically those kind of industry rates are anywhere between kind of $25 and $50, so US dollars, per thousand downloads, which means you have to be getting hundreds of thousands of downloads before that even becomes remotely kind of interesting. So that's not a very productive thing. So the things that we've just talked about, the other reasons to start a podcast, is where I would focus first. And then if and when you grow this really great audience, then that's the time to monetize. However, I have definitely seen podcasts with much, much smaller audiences really successfully monetize. And they manage that for a couple of different reasons. Firstly, they're really crystal clear on who their audience is. So who's listening? What demographic are they? What value do they present to any potential sponsor? If you can say, cool, I've got 100 listeners in the world, but they're all IT decision makers, but you know, from enterprise organizations in the UK, that's an incredibly specific demographic that you have there, and a high value one, right? That you can take to a sponsor and say, cool, look, these people actually make financial decisions for the market that you're serving. So that's one way. One element. And by the way, it doesn't have to be that, you know, it could be, you know, graduates of the age of 22 to 25 that have a particular interest in fintech like yourself. You know, if you can be really, really crystal clear on that, that really helps. The second one is personal relationships with these sponsors. So rather than going to a traditional kind of podcast monetization platform like a network, all they're going to be able to offer you is that cost per thousand, $25 to $50 per thousand downloads. Whereas if you reach out directly to a brand and say, cool, I've got X number of listeners, these are the demographics, these are the styles of listeners that we have, these are the topics that they care about, this is the reason that they listen. And you can put together a really kind of compelling case to a brand where there's a really clear alignment in the content and the audience to that brand. Then there's absolutely no reason that can't work, even at very, very small numbers. Even if you've only got a couple of hundred downloads per episode, that can work. you just have to have a really real clarity on who the best brand fits are and what your sort of audience is made up of. So that's the monetization thing. Yeah, I guess that the main point is I wouldn't go into it with that mindset. I would go into it for other reasons and then monetize later, or have a lot of kind of money to burn to grow that audience in the outset and just go hard at growing it. That's getting harder and harder because there are a lot of people with much deeper pockets kind of going after this same audience. So it's getting harder every day. But if that's your play, then that's totally valid. Jordan Harbinger is a really great example of this. He has grown his audience from nothing to being a really, really successful, very large number of downloads, really well monetized. But he had budget to throw at it, and he just went all in on podcasts. So he's the sort of gold standard of that in the business world, I would say.
Like, so why that's kind of so cool is because like the opportunity is going to come elsewhere as well. If you don't come in with a idea of making money, you'll be surprised where it pays dividends to. So, in my own situation, like I didn't plan on making any money from it. I don't plan on making any decent cash from it for at least 2 years. And you may know, his name is Mike Winnett. He has a series called Entrepreneur. So he goes like, like checking out all guys like Gary Vee and stuff. That's all like analysis of them. But he's had loads of podcasts have all been really successful, and he's kind of like he just closes them down, starts new ones. But he interviewed Chris Williamson, is another really big podcaster, and the whole premise on it was like, you're not going to turn profitable, if you're on your individual for at least 3 years. Obviously there's exceptions, and obviously you could launch really well and do this, but he was like, if you are sticking in this for a long time, that's when you're going to start turning profitable, because everything else moves together. Then, you're going to get a lot of other benefits. And that's kind of what I was thinking myself, was like, like yourself, you have an agency now, which is really cool and really like, original. You may be consulting, offers and opportunities that might come up. You may go into music production or other types of production if you are that way inclined. I'm not, but you obviously were. So I think there's also different spin-offs then, or you could simply build an audience and say, hey, now I'm coming out with my product. I am now launching an app. Here's what it is. It's unrelated to my podcast, So that's kind of how it changed my mind. It was like, because I actually had a conversation with a guy before we got on the call, and he said, he was like, what's the idea? He goes, when are you going to go fully into like committing to this? And I was like, as it stands, man, I was like, I think I could build something else off of it, but I don't think I could build this. I don't necessarily want to just build this on its own. I was thinking there could be more opportunities, So that's kind of the way my head's kind of framed.
Absolutely. No, and I think you're right. I think it's a wonderful string to any kind of entrepreneur's bow, but I think it's a small subset of podcasters that are going to make a real financial success from it. So I think, I think sort of don't go into it thinking that this is where the riches are. It's a hot space, but that doesn't mean that it's easy to kind of make a living this way.
Of course, it's the same with anything. It's the same with YouTube and stuff like that. Like I think it was like only like 1 or like 10% of YouTubers are actually making money compared to the 44 billion accounts that are there, or million accounts that are on there. Last section I wanted to discuss was around the future of podcasting. So talked a lot about this before, and before we started recording, we were talking about Clubhouse and Spotify, green rooms, which have pretty much evaporated in thin air. Things change so quickly, but one thing that is kind of for sure is the big players like Spotify are just pounding money into it. So obviously Joe Rogan got pulled across, so they call her daddy, and now they need to see a return on this investment. So between the two of them, that's 160 million between just two of them. So there has to become some return, but they have to pull other people along possibly. So what's your consensus on this at the moment?
Yeah, and it was really interesting because they also bought a company called Gimlet Media, who produce a load of incredible podcasts. They're a New York-based company, they were a 200 million purchase for Spotify, and they released some numbers, or rather, some numbers were leaked recently from September 2020, so a year ago, that showed that Joe Rogan accounted for, I can't remember the percentage that Joe Rogan accounted for, but it was about 20% of listening time of Spotify's original content, so their owned brands, their walled content. About 20%, I think, was Joe Rogan, but this Gimlet purchase that was 200 million accounted for just 4%. So they're spending a huge amount of money on it, but actually not that many people are listening to this thing on the platform. So they're really, really kind of doubling down or having to sort of adjust their strategy on kind of what content is walled and gated versus what is available on all the other platforms like Apple and Stitcher and all those kinds of places. So I think Spotify is a really, really interesting kind of thing to follow, company to follow. And what that speaks to is this kind of walled content. I think that's another of the biggest trends. And we talked about kind of monetization. One of the things that's really kind of changed over the last 6 months is this ability to have premium paid subscribers to your podcast. Well, I say 6 months, even less than that. They're just starting to open up now. So you can have it, we talk about that Pat Flynn, Kevin Kelly, 1,000 True Fans. We are in a position now where those 1,000 True Fans could subscribe to your content, similar to a sort of Patreon model, but much more tightly integrated with kind of Spotify and Apple. So I think a lot more creators are going to be able to kind of support themselves in that way. And I think that's also going to change the kinds of content that become available, because you have to be able to grow an audience and then take a subset of that audience that are willing to pay and create, extra content for them that they pay for. So I think that's really interesting. I think the Clubhouse and Green Room and Twitter Spaces and Fireside Chat and all these like endless different companies that are all attempting, you mentioned before, LinkedIn is talking about doing this as well. I didn't know about that, which is super interesting. This kind of live chat stuff. I think it's interesting. It seems like it feels to me, well, the proof is in the pudding. We'll see. It feels like a flash in the pan, but I don't know. Certainly as a user myself, I was very excited about it. I dove into it and then was immediately kind of turned off by just the amount of sheer noise. And basically the benefit, I think the wonderful kind of thing about podcasting is that we can condense this conversation that you and I have had. You can remove all of the crap waffle with me messing stuff up and then your camera not working halfway through. We can kind of change that. You can remove all of that stuff, right? So the listener doesn't have to go through all that. But on a Clubhouse, you're just there, you get what you get. And if something, if you get someone that comes in halfway through the conversation, asks a really boring question that you're not interested in, well, then suck it up. You got to just deal with it or leave. So I think there's some interesting things to kind of deal with there. But I think there's a lot of kind of overlap between live radio, like traditional radio, and the kind of Clubhouse scene. I think we can, if we want to be successful at an influencer in that space, I think we can learn a lot from, the old school radio DJs. So I think it's interesting, but I think that podcasting and Clubhouse, have a lot in common, but also they really kind of exist independently. Mm-hmm. I think generally the other trend that I think is super interesting, again, to do with Spotify, is the change of the demographic of listeners. So I think we're seeing, traditionally the podcast listenership was very much millennial focused, a bit more male leaning, very kind of white middle class, basically, US, UK, Australia, Canada, those kind of places. And I think what Spotify is doing, and the sort of opening up of their platform, is opening up to more kind of Android users and stuff. I think that's including a much broader range of countries but also ages. And so I think, particularly for a show that leans in the direction that yours does, I think there's probably more kind of younger listeners getting into podcasting now. And also I think a lot of those younger listeners really appreciate shorter form content. We're seeing real success, particularly on Spotify, with sort of sub 15-minute episodes, because then Spotify are including that in their kind of playlists, which mix kind of music and podcasts. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. So yeah, those are some of the things that I'm thinking about at the moment.
It's cool. Like big kind of backer there, really a big team is just, Spotify leading the way. They seem to have the audience to kind of direct and grow this, but I think the subscriptions is an interesting model, because you'll take someone who has an audience and then they can spin off and do other things and offer more services. And that's when it becomes more of a kind of an occupation lifestyle thing. Because like, let's say, for instance, I record on a Wednesday, I upload on a Wednesday, this episode will go up on Wednesday. If I was to do something like that and offer, if someone's paying me $2.99, man, they would at least need 2 more episodes a week, Monday and Friday. But if I'm doing things Monday, Friday, then I'm editing Tuesday, Thursday. So that's when it becomes like, okay, this actually is feasible, but I do need to have those pillars in place, like you need to have a big audience, you need to have 1,000 people paying $2.99 a month.
I would question that about the extra episodes. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think actually some of the really successful creators are actually, what they're doing is they're doing the the version of the podcast that you hear on the public feed, and then they're doing like bonus content. So that might be extended uncut interviews, that might be behind the scenes, that might be other bits and pieces. But actually, I think a lot of the time what that premium paid for tier is allowing is those super fans to just support you, and you just need to give them some extra content. Like it might be getting episodes early, or it might be sneak peeks of stuff that you're working on. It doesn't necessarily have to be generating a ton more content, actually. I mean, that is one direction you could go, but I don't think that's necessarily the what has to happen. So I think it's you might be surprised at the little of additional stuff you have to do in order to kind of justify that investment. But like you're saying, you need that critical mass of listenership, because only a percentage of them are going to actually pay. So you've got to kind of build the audience in the same way that you do for sponsorship or anything else.
Yeah, 1% to 3% or whatever, even a little bit higher.
Exactly.
But that's cool though. I didn't actually think about it in that way. It's interesting, even these conversations. I would have always thought you'd have to provide more value, but you can actually repurpose and do more things. So that's
absolutely,
just rolling with the times, Last question I want to leave you on is, what do you think is the biggest threat to podcasting at the moment? So, me and you were on the inside. What do you think? What's your thoughts in comparison to, let's say, YouTube, which is a rolling mammoth of a machine? It's been around for as long as I can barely go on the computer. So, it's interesting. Like, there's people would say, oh yeah, if someone's a YouTuber, they lose YouTube, it's over. What happens? What's a threat to kind of podcasting from your own perspective?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think that we saw through COVID a real dip in listenership early on. So March, April time, we saw a real dip in listenership. And the reason for that, broadly speaking, was that commutes went away. People's daily habits changed. And so suddenly the time where everyone had set aside for listening to podcasts disappeared. It used to be that they would listen on their way to work, typically taking the kids to school, going to the gym, that kind of stuff. And that time in the car just disappeared. And so did that listening time. It very quickly recovered as people kind of changed their habits and thought about the ways that they, consume this stuff. And so a lot of listening is happening at the gym or while you're cooking or whatever. So these things have changed, but it did have an impact. And so I think that does kind of teach us that, habits can change and things can alter. Honestly, I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm just, naively optimistic, but I can only see an upward trajectory at the moment, because I can't see a demand for people's need to be entertained, be educated, to learn new things. I can't see that going away. And podcasting is an incredibly valuable kind of medium to deliver that stuff. Radio is still incredibly popular, despite the fact that guys of your generation and frankly, a lot of mine maybe don't find it as relevant or interesting anymore. We're much more interested in listening to the stuff that we specifically want to listen to, not just what happens to be on the radio right this minute. But still, that's hugely, hugely popular. So listening to content is still a really, really strong habit. So whether Clubhouse eats into that time and we see a shrinking of time on podcasting versus live chat platforms like Clubhouse, I don't know. I don't think so, but that could change. But then other technologies are coming in to kind of alter that as well. So, smart speakers, that kind of was the hot ticket a year or two ago. It sort of has been a bit of a, underwhelming kind of launch there. It's not a lot has happened. We thought it was going to make a big impact, but it hasn't made a lot of change. But still, there's kind of stuff to be explored there. There's a lot will change there in the future, I'm sure. In-car audio and kind of those integrated kind of experiences are going to change the way that people are consuming audio and thinking about that kind of content. Self-driving cars, I mean, we won't have to listen to audio. We might be able to watch video in our car. These habits, I think, will change over time. But maybe I'm just too overly optimistic. Maybe that's the hubris of an entrepreneur, but you just sort of think, well, I can only see interest in podcasts going up as people kind of get turned onto them. So ask me again in 5 years when my business has collapsed and it's been proved that I was a complete moron. Who knows?
No, I completely agree with you, man. I completely agree with you. Like, I think that's the way it's going. It will evolve, and we'll have to make slight adjustments along the way. We could be running webinars on fucking LinkedIn in a couple of years, because when I hear live audio coming, I thought Clubhouse was, yes, because, a bit of a quick fix, move on. But the one thing that I heard about Clubhouse that was interesting, that was helpful, was the fact that they were trying to monetize in such a way that creators would be able to host events. So let's say Lex Friedman would host an AI talk for 99 cents, and you'd now get 50,000 people in there. So that was the only thing that I thought of that was really relevant. And so that's kind of what I'm thinking about, like rolling with the times, where you have core competency and then you have some side businesses. But that's the idea, like whether it's your main focus or your side gig, you'll hopefully always be there in some shape, form or another.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree.
So I say a massive thank you, Harry. This was great. I really appreciate it. I think what you're doing is fantastic, and I wish you all the very best in the future. I think that, more brands will be coming into the space, more people will be, and it'll be people looking to people like yourself and other agencies to see, really who's kind of had best in class for the last 5 years at this stage.
Well, fingers crossed. I hope so. But yeah, thanks, Adam. Really appreciate you having me on. Thank you.